it downtown here? Oh, nice.
This is what I do.
Hi, thank you, Doris, for such a warm introduction. And as I said yesterday, we're thrilled to, putting my administrative hat on for a second, we're thrilled to be working with Professor Magachi on this event. Now, I'm going to talk about the book and what it made me think about from two perspectives. One is my perspective as a Yiddishist, as a scholar of Yiddish literature and culture, and another one is an oral historian. Now, but before that, if one stops and thinks about it, there is nothing unnatural about putting out a volume entitled Jews and Ukrainians. Major developments in Jewish history took place in Ukraine. Hasidism, for example, or Israeli Nobel Prize winner Shmuel Agnon was born there. Sholem Aleichem, arguably the most popular Yiddish writer who ever lived, comes from Ukraine. Speaking of Yiddish, they say, Yiddish, an important Jewish language, they say can only be translated with a reliable degree of accuracy into Ukrainian. Not English, everyone knows that, not French, not even Russian or Polish, but Ukrainian. Having said that, I still remember the voice of my former professor, David Roskis, the Yiddish literature professor, who taught us in numerous classes in grad school back in the Stone Age of the 1990s, that Sholem Aleichem and his predecessor, Abramovich, better known as Mendele Moichis Forum, both originating from Ukraine, both classics of Yiddish literature, never mentioned Ukraine by name in their novels. All of their novels took place in Ukraine, but the reader wouldn't know it. Jews constituted, as the book tells us, at some point 1 in about 9 people living in Ukraine. The book cites in 1897, there were 2 million Jews living in Ukraine and 17 million Ukrainians. And it discusses numerous instances of cross-cultural fertilization between Jews and Ukrainians over the course of their long history of coexistence. So why is it so unusual, so controversial, and so troubling to talk about the encounter in history? Why are there so many unanswered questions? The authors of the book, my colleague Bob Magachi and Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern, know exactly why. In fact, they start the book on page 2 with a list of stereotypes that Jews and Ukrainians hold against one another. I won't recite them here, but I have to tell you that as a Jew growing up in Russia to Ukrainian-born parents, I heard almost all of them. About Ukraine having little respect for Jews on the Jewish side, about not only Jews being killed in Babi Yar, and then why make a big deal out of it, and why make a big deal out of Holocaust on the other side as well. When I moved to the western part of the world, first to England, then to the United States, and then finally to Canada, I learned more about history of Jews in Ukraine, and I learned more of those myths. First of all, I learned that there were pogroms. I didn't know that when I lived in Russia. Then I learned that Cossacks were involved in these pogroms and were killing Jews. I also learned that Holodomor, the famine, is perceived as communist-made, Jewish-made attack on Ukrainians. Both perceptions were very hard for me to understand, especially that I knew about so many Jewish families who died in famine and heard of Jewish people serving for Petlura, but also being killed by Petlura. But one thing seemed clear. New information came in, but the myth of mutual hostility and distrust of Jews and Ukrainians got stronger in my head, and not only in mine. My work on oral history of Soviet Jews, during which I conducted over about 500 interviews with Soviet Jews born in the 1920s and earlier, about 350 of them were born in Ukraine, only confirmed this perception. Jewish people who grew up in various areas of Ukraine and who survived the war under the Romanian occupation or in Soviet Central Asia or served in the Red Army usually had good things to say about their immediate Ukrainian friends and family, but had almost nothing but negativity for Ukraine as a country, as a land. If anything, they refuse to call themselves Ukrainian Jews, but instead call themselves Russian Jews, or more often, Russians. But, as the authors of the book remind us, the historical accuracy of myths have no relevance to their significance. And the book takes on a very ambitious task of writing a detailed yet brief history of Ukrainian and Jewish history in Ukraine. So, as they say, both Jews and Ukrainians learn about one another and about themselves. Now, the book is very rich with facts, data, interesting observation, and I think it's exemplary in how it looks. I couldn't stop but admiring it. The glossy paper, beautifully selected illustrations, nice, easy to read font, big margins, all these things we take for granted, but they make such an important difference. I think that will surely end up on coffee tables and mantelpieces. And a few things that I'm going to say about, things that I started thinking about as I was reading the book. They're not meant to criticize the project, just meant to provide kind of the things, the avenues of further research it might inspire, as I think it should. Now, I know that writing a summary of a big project always comes with choices. You have to make a decision every single moment, which story goes in, which story doesn't, and why is that? But one of the things that was interesting to me to think about and that struck me as unusual is that in both histories of Jews and Ukrainians, I did not notice many women. I mean, they appear in small numbers. I know women lived in Ukraine and Jews, among Jews and Ukrainians. That's how humans procreate. They have to be mothers and daughters and all this. But women were discussed for the first time on page 102 in the context of hairstyles, the braids. Well, I have to admit that my daughters were certainly very interested in that part of the book. I'm intimidated by braids, I have to admit. But it seems to me that the volume could have given a little bit more voice and agency to women and make them more integral part of the historical narrative in context of events and, of course, the context of violence. And the reason I bring up violence is that in discussion of pogroms of the 20th century, of the early 20th century, it seemed to me that bringing up women would have been very important. We learned from the book that there were about 50 to 60,000 Jews who were killed during the pogroms in the early 20th century. About 1 million of them were displaced and 100,000 children orphaned. But what's not mentioned is the sexual violence that affected, in some places of Ukraine, over 70% of women who lived there. And it devastated communities to a large extent, some people might argue a larger extent, than looting and physical destruction. New work in the field by Jeffrey Weidlinger, Irina Stashkevich, Elisa Ben-Porat began to address those issues in the English language literature, but already existing and published Russian and Yiddish language sources, especially the archive by Cherikova, which I know the authors consulted, talks about this in quite detail, and I think it's really important to think about this in the context of the both Ukrainian and Jewish history. Now, speaking of women, I was also thinking, also as an oral historian, you can't get that hat off yourself very easily. I wanted more people. I wanted to know how these people, individual people, make decisions, how they make their choices, how they work, where they live. And I wanted to see some portraits of individuals living through this sometimes fertile, sometimes difficult, sometimes contact and conflicts in Ukrainian Jewish relations. There's a lot of stories like this when the book discusses music and art, and literature, and I appreciated such a large sections devoted to this. It's rare, actually, to see so much attention paid to literature and culture in a book written by two historians. I really appreciate that. But we always want more, right? So the book does not shy away from discussing controversial topics such as famine, Holodomor, World War II, and its memory of today's Ukraine and others. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the history of famine is discussed in the book in quite some detail. It talks about famine as the Sovietization project, ultimately a result of Stalin's policies. And it works on debunking the myth that Jews in their position as Soviet officials stood behind orchestrating the famine. It's all there, but it would be interesting to think about, and I think more research needs to be done on that, on thinking on famine. A is a global European phenomenon. At that time, famine was in Russia, Kazakhstan as well, but also thinking about Jews as victims of famine. I have to admit that I was not very familiar with I was familiar with history of famine, but I was really not familiar until I came to Toronto with this whole memory of famine and how controversial it is, the Jews being involved in all this. I learned that actually in this room when I attended some events of our Ukrainian studies colleague when all this stuff was discussed. But the reason why I was not aware of this was that I actually studied 1930s of Ukraine, and I interviewed people who lived through famine in Ukraine. And the only people I interviewed were Jews. And to them, living through famine was one of the largest traumas of their life. And I have so many stories that I recorded how Jews suffered and through the famine, how they managed to survive, how many people did not survive. I also read those stories in a wonderful collection of oral history interviews collected by Leonid Fimberg in Kiev that has over 300 oral history of Jews living in Ukraine about that same generation, where that topic is discussed in very many details as well. So I think that instead of debunking the myth, saying it's not true, it would be really interesting to think about the diverse victims of the famine and what it means for our understanding of history. Now, one cannot study the history of Jews and Ukrainians without, of course, dealing with World War II and with what's happening today with its memory. I have a lot of questions about the World War II section and about the section that talks about the memory, but I'm sure it will come up in the discussion of others, and I will use my time later, if not, to talk about as well. But I wanted to point your attention to one aspect of World War II in this book, which I really appreciated being covered. And it is the work of ethnomusicologist Moisei Beregovsky, who spent the war collecting Yiddish songs and Yiddish stories of survivors of the Holocaust in Ukraine. He has done this work in 1943, 1944, 1945. In other words, as soon as Ukraine was liberated, Beregovsky and his team went and talked to survivors. Often they also got letters from Jews serving in the Red Army or living in ghettos or hiding somewhere, writing songs about that experience. So it's not very well known that Beregovsky was doing this during the war, and I really like the fact that the book pays attention to this man and to his project and to the Cabinet for Jewish Proletarian Culture that was responsible for this project. Beregovsky was arrested by Stalin in 1949, released 1955, but never, and died in 1961, but he never made public the fact that he collected this music. And why am I bringing up music when we talk about World War II and about Ukrainian Jewish cultural relations? Because the songs that he collected talk about nothing else. They're in Yiddish. They don't shy away from topics that we all want to shy away from, like collaboration of Ukrainians during World War II, how Jews and Ukrainians fighting together in World War II. They talk about Hitler's desire to invade the Soviet Union to get access to natural resources, and all that stuff that we think is so contemporary, but actually was very relevant in 1944. And because the book is so rich with illustrations of art and gives us a chance to look at this, but of course you can't put music in the book unless it's a very sophisticated multimedia production. I thought I would end my presentation by playing you one of these songs from the collection of Beregovsky that's fully translated into English, as you will see, and that creates this bridge between the past of World War II and the present. The music for this tune, this is how the document looks like, so you can see it from Beregovsky's archive. As you will see from the words of the song, Ukraine appears proudly so in the Yiddish words. The tune is written by Alexander Crane, and it talks about, it was recorded in 1944 from Velva-Shagorodsky, and it is an important example of Ukrainian Jewish relations that as it translates into today. It's performed by Psoy Korolenko, a singer from Moscow, accompanied by St. Petersburg-based Roma band called Loiko, and a number of Toronto musicians, Jewish and non-Jewish. The song proclaims loudly and clearly the eternal end of fascism, something that we all strive to see today. So if the technology is with me, you're going to hear it.
Schmeien sich die Teitschelech, arob gelos die Nuss. Sag, was hat es getroffen, die Reuteitschele Barim? Och, hat uns gegeben, das Wegele von Krim. Sei je nicht mir Bräugis, oi sei je nicht in Kass. Was ist mit Kafkas und was ist mit Tanenbaum? So dort ein Hitler geplane wird Geschäft. Ois groben die Keul, neus Pompen bemneft. Dort sot schein uns das Wegele, vermachte wird der Russ. Haben wir von dort sich abtragen gemusst. So von Ukraine, seid ihr gora weg? Haben wir schon euch dort kein Ohrneck nicht geweckt? Die Deutschelach arob gelos die Nuss. No Fosche Farvojake, seid ihr doch erzieht. Von allen Seiten dieser Sochen weh und dient. Dann nicht steh und dann nicht geh, oi, es ist nicht gut. Deutschland ist auf Zores, Hitler ist kaputt. Deutschland ist auf Zores, Hitler ist kaputt.
So as you can see, Ukraine is a place firmly returned to Yiddish, and the Donbass and Crimea are still sites of violence, but the roles have changed. It is Russia now who is trying to get those lands, and Germany is trying to, do what it can to not let it happen. But the point is, Ukraine is there, and culture helps us to think about the past and the future. Thank you.